The year is 1944. The place a humid, tangled hell of coconut palms and razor-sharp elephant grass, the island of Leyte, Philippines. The sun has just surrendered to the relentless tropical darkness, a darkness so profound it swallows the very sounds of the jungle, leaving behind only the buzzing tension of war. For the soldiers of the United States Army's 1st Cavalry Division, the transition from day to night was never just a loss of light. It was an embrace of the unknown, the moment when the Japanese, masters of infiltration and night fighting, became truly invisible. The air was thick with the scent of decay, sweat, and the metallic tang of fear. Every shadow, every rustle of the enormous unfamiliar leaves was a potential bayonet. Our story does not begin with the clang of steel or the roar of a Sherman tank, but with a whisper and a small flickering light. It begins with the realization that, in this conflict, where industrial might met fanatical resolve, the line between survival and annihilation could be drawn by the simplest of signals, transmitted by the most unlikely of heroes. We focus on a lone platoon, Charlie Company, moving into what they hoped was a secure staging area near a half-destroyed, nameless village. Sergeant Frank Ace Moretti, a man whose face had aged a decade in the last 9 months of island hopping, led the point. Moretti was exhausted, his senses dulled by weeks of fighting, but his training was a harness that held him together. He moved with the slow, deliberate caution of someone who knew the jungle was always watching and always hungry. The immediate tactical situation was dire. Leyte was intended as a stepping stone, a decisive battle to reclaim the Philippines. The Japanese High Command, desperate to hold their imperial prize, had reinforced the island far beyond Allied intelligence estimates. Every inch gained was paid for in blood. The troops had been promised soft, demoralized resistance. Instead, they found themselves facing an enemy who fought, sometimes literally to the last man. Moretti's platoon was low on water, dangerously low on ammunition, and running solely on the fumes of duty. Their objective was a small rise of land overlooking a coastal trail, a crucial choke point. Holding it meant severing a key supply line for the Imperial Japanese Army, IJA. Losing it meant being cut off and exposed. What they did not know, the historical irony that hung in the humid air like a suffocating blanket, was that the Japanese 16th Division, the storied unit known as the Kyoto Division, had abandoned their earlier defensive positions and were now setting a cunning, classic trap. The area Moretti was marching towards was not a safe zone. It was a killing field, meticulously prepared. The IJA engineers had spent the daylight hours digging shallow spider holes and camouflaging machine gun nests along the trail. The plan was terrifyingly simple. Allow the Americans to move into the clearing, wait for the platoon to break formation for the night, and then, at the precise moment of greatest vulnerability, just before dawn, unleash a devastating crossfire. The Japanese commander, Lieutenant Hiroshi Kato, a man whose strategic brilliance was matched only by his ruthless dedication, watched from the dense thicket. For him, this was not just a battle, it was an execution. But the jungle held more than just soldiers. It was also home to the Filipino people, caught in a nightmarish 4-year struggle between 2 foreign powers. Their loyalty was complex, often shifting with the local balance of power, but their desire for freedom was constant. In that small ruined village lived 2 siblings, Marco, 15, and his sister Clara, 12. They had lost their parents to a Japanese punitive raid months earlier, and now lived by their wits, hidden in the ruins of an old Spanish colonial-era church. They had seen the American movements. They had also seen the silent, meticulous preparation of the IJA. They understood the language of war better than most adults, the way the dirt was moved, the placement of a tripwire, the absolute silence that meant imminent violence. Their home was about to become the epicenter of a massacre. The stakes were clear, a patrol of 30 men, exhausted and focused on the immediate task of survival, marching directly into a perfectly laid, textbook ambush. The only way to save them was to breach the gap between 2 vastly different worlds, the world of the weary GI and the world of the local, invisible resistance. How do you warn an army you cannot approach, an army whose rules of engagement are shoot first, question never, especially in the deceptive shadows of the night? The answer lay in the memory of a simple children's game, a code based on rhythm and light, taught to them by their father. The tools. A battered surplus kerosene lantern, a relic from a forgotten era now charged with a monumental purpose. The darkness deepened. Sergeant Moretti gave the signal to halt, ordering his men to establish a perimeter. He looked out at the impenetrable blackness, the silence broken only by the chirping of insects. He felt the familiar cold knot of dread tighten in his stomach. Something felt wrong. The jungle was too quiet. The silence was a lie. He raised his binoculars one last time, scanning the darkness, knowing that the real threat lay not in what he could see, but in the small, almost imperceptible signs that only a few locals would ever notice. He was looking for Japanese sentries, but he should have been looking for a light, a faint rhythmic flicker that carried a message far more urgent than any radio transmission. The two children were now positioned high in the church tower, their hearts pounding a faster rhythm than the distant, muffled sound of the American patrol setting up camp. They had moments before the men would be committed to the kill zone. The clock had started. The lantern was lit. If you want to continue experiencing the drama, suspense, and precise historical detail of this epic tale, please take a moment to subscribe and turn on notifications. Your support helps us uncover more untold stories of courage from the Second World War. The lantern flickered, not randomly, not by the breath of the wind, but with intention. Up in the dilapidated church tower, Marco held the kerosene lantern, its light focused and shielded by a cracked piece of tin. His sister Clara, her eyes sharp and constantly scanning, was the lookout, whispering directions. Not there, Marco. The big coconut. They must see the light against the trunk, not the sky. The light was small, a mere firefly struggling against the vast canvas of the tropical night. The visibility was perhaps 500 meters at best, right to the edge of the American perimeter. They could not use a standard Morse code. The Japanese patrol elements were too close, too attuned to signals, and the rhythmic dit-da-dit would instantly betray their position. Their code had to be a ghost, seemingly random, brief, and easily dismissed as a natural occurrence, the swinging of a lamp in a ruined house or a trick of the eye. Their father, a former fisherman and resistance fighter, had taught them the code. It was built on the most basic language of emergency. A double flash meant danger, a single flash meant all clear or location confirmed. The pattern they were using now, however, was far more complex. A specific warning built for this very landscape. 2 quick, short flashes, followed by a pause, and then one long, held flash. It meant, trap ahead, do not stop, flanked on both sides. The entire sequence had to be delivered within 2 minutes, repeated 3 times, and then vanish forever. For Sergeant Moretti and his men, the night was a trial of patience and nerves. They were digging in, scraping shallow foxholes into the hard-packed earth. Peeved Tommy Mac McNamara, a young radio man from Brooklyn, was struggling with his SCR 300 radio. The humid air and the dense canopy were playing havoc with the signal. "Anything, Mac?" Moretti whispered, moving silently between the foxholes. "Static, Sarge. Just soup. Looks like we're sleeping with the fishes tonight." "We're sleeping with the Emperor's finest, Mac. Keep your eyes open." It was then that Moretti noticed it. A tiny, almost imperceptible flicker in the distance high up. It was near the remains of the church, a known landmark. He dismissed it instantly. A firefly, a trick of the light, perhaps the wind catching a shard of glass. His training told him that a deliberate light signal was a fool's game in a war zone. It was a beacon for enemy fire. But the light repeated, not immediately, but after a tense moment of silence. Flash, flash, pause. F-L-A-S-H. Moretti squinted, his mind racing. He was a pragmatic man, a survivor, not a man given to superstition. Yet the pattern felt deliberate. He scanned the surrounding jungle again. The silence was still the main terror. Where were the crickets? Where were the normal night noises? An enemy preparing to attack often silences the jungle by its sheer, disciplined proximity. The unnatural quiet was the real signal. He turned to his medic, Doc Miller, who had served in the Pacific for years. "Doc, look up there, near the belfry, you see that?" Miller, older and more cynical, watched for a moment. "Yeah, looks like a broken light. Maybe a Jap trying to signal their own, or maybe just a local trying to find his way." The light sequence repeated a third and final time. Marco and Clara extinguished the lantern, praying that their father's lessons, which had once seemed like child's play, had been understood. They had done their part. Now the burden of belief fell on the Americans. Moretti shook his head, a chilling certainty creeping into his exhausted mind. It's too fast for a random light. Too specific, and it's coming from high ground, aimed right at us. He remembered a briefing months ago about local Filipino resistance groups, often using simple signals, often discounted. The irony was almost cruel, a sophisticated army of engineers and strategists being warned by a flicker of kerosene. The Japanese Lieutenant Kato, positioned less than 100 yards from the American left flank, was growing impatient. The Americans were digging in, a predictable maneuver. He was ready to give the final order. His men, highly trained in Gyokusai, glorious self-sacrifice tactics, were waiting for the signal rocket. Moretti made a snap decision, the kind that separates a sergeant from a survivor. He couldn't risk the entire platoon's safety on a guess, but he also couldn't ignore the knot of dread and the bizarre rhythmic light. "Mac, tell the platoons on the line to break formation, quietly. I want everyone out of these holes and moving back towards the river immediately. If anyone asks, we're adjusting the perimeter because of a waterlogged trench. No radio chatter, hand signals only. Move." His men looked at him with confusion, then grudging obedience. Digging those holes had been brutal work, and now they were abandoning them. They moved with the silent professionalism of men who knew that questioning orders was secondary to living to see dawn. In the span of 90 seconds, the foxholes were empty. The killing zone had become a vacant stage. The air was tense, the silence now deafening. A mere 3 minutes after the last rhythmic flash of the lantern, Lieutenant Kato, confident in his trap, raised his hand and fired a small green flare. The signal rocket arced silently into the sky, exploding in a shower of sparks that illuminated the clearing. But instead of the expected sounds of Japanese machine guns opening fire on stationary targets, there was a brief, stunned silence from the concealed Japanese positions. Then the silence shattered, not by enemy fire, but by the furious whispers of Lieutenant Kato, realizing his ambush had failed, followed by the terrifying realization that the Americans were gone. The quiet departure of 30 men had just thwarted a planned massacre. Moretti, now 20 yards back, peering through the darkness, watched the flare. The green light was meant to confirm their presence. Instead, it confirmed their escape. The terror was not in the light itself, but in the truth it revealed. The trap was sprung, but the prey had vanished. He knew then that the flickering lantern had not been a mistake. It had been the soundless 2-minute warning that saved their lives. The Japanese military doctrine on Leyte was rooted in deception and the exploitation of the enemy's confidence. For the Americans, their reliance on vast industrial power, tanks, heavy artillery, air superiority, often led to an overconfidence that the Japanese exploited in the night. This was the fundamental strategic contradiction of the Leyte campaign. Lieutenant Kato was the personification of this doctrine. A graduate of the Imperial Army Academy, he had studied the American fixation on the front, realizing that their flanks were often their weakness, particularly in dense jungle. His ambush design was a masterpiece of Bushido tactics fused with modern geometry. His trap involved 2 Type 92 heavy machine guns, firing the formidable 7.7mm cartridge positioned in diagonal nests, creating a devastating crossfire aimed squarely at the Americans' expected resting line. Supporting these heavy weapons were 2 squads armed with Type 99 rifles and the feared knee mortar, designed to drop high-explosive rounds directly into the foxholes. The concept was not just to kill, but to eliminate instantly, before a counterattack could be organized. The Americans' 2-minute window of vulnerability would have been fatal. As the green flare died out and the Japanese commander's furious whispers filled the night, Moretti's men melted further into the jungle. Their movement was silent, driven by a renewed, almost superstitious fear. The uncanny silence of the enemy combined with the strange light had created a tension far more potent than any direct firefight. "Sarge, what the hell was that flare?" Mac whispered, his rifle held tight. "That, Mac, was the light that was meant to find us dead," Moretti replied, his voice strained. "Someone pulled us out of the line of fire." Moretti did not yet fully grasp the source of the warning, only its undeniable effect. He ordered his men to pivot, taking up new defensive positions deep in the ravine, a position the Japanese would not expect them to occupy, believing them still to be at the crest. The strategic technology of the Japanese was not in heavy metal, but in camouflage and silence. Their uniform material and their personal discipline made them nearly invisible. Their communication was often limited to whispered commands or hand signals, ensuring that their infiltration teams, or sneakers, could operate right under the American nose. The irony lay in the fact that a complex, expensive radar system might have missed the presence of Kato's men, yet a single rudimentary kerosene lantern, used with precise timing, had penetrated their deception. Meanwhile, back in the ruined church, Marco and Clara were huddled, listening. The flare, the sudden burst of green light, confirmed their fear that the trap was imminent, but the ensuing silence was their victory. The barrage had not come. "They saw it, Clara," Marco breathed, holding his sister close. "The Americans saw the light." "Or they just got lucky," Clara said, ever the skeptic, hardened by the harsh realities of occupation. "No," Marco insisted. "The pattern. Papa said the pattern is stronger than luck." Their father's training was a ghost in the tower with them, a silent third party in the drama. He had taught them the rhythmic code to alert his fellow guerrillas to Japanese patrol movements. Marco's heart pounded not from fear of the Japanese, but from the immense responsibility of having gambled the lives of 30 strangers on a fading childhood memory. For Lieutenant Kato, the failure was a devastating tactical blow, but more importantly, a psychological one. A professional soldier, he had committed all the resources of a seasoned company to this ambush. His reputation, his honor, were staked on the success of this move. "Find the patrol," Kato barked, his voice dangerously low. "The Americans have retreated. They were warned. It is impossible. Who would dare defy the Emperor's army in such a blatant manner? Search the village. Look for any sign of communication. We will teach these Indios the cost of betrayal." Kato's immediate pivot revealed the rigidity of the Japanese military mindset, an inability to tolerate the unexpected, an assumption of total control over the civilian population. He believed the warning must have been an elaborate Allied guerrilla radio signal, a technological failure on his part. He completely discounted the possibility of a simple, local warning. His strategic brilliance was undermined by his cultural blindness. The narrative now splits. Moretti's platoon, now safer but completely disoriented, trying to regroup and understand the miracle that saved them, and Kato's unit, driven by wounded pride and the need for vengeance, swarming the village, looking for a radio, a transmitter, a piece of sophisticated American equipment. They would never think to look for a child's toy. Moretti gathered his non-commissioned officers. "We don't go back up that hill. Not tonight. We're flanking wide, moving down to the river and holding there. I want a small scout team, Mac, you take 2 men, to circle the original position at first light. Find out what they left behind. Find the pattern of the trap. And most importantly, find out who or what told us to run." The stage was set for a deadly cat-and-mouse game. The American platoon, now moving on faith and instinct, driven by the mystery of the light, and the Japanese, humiliated and vengeful, descending on the village, their discipline rapidly fraying into fury. The 2 children, the source of the warning, were now in the direct path of the Japanese punitive search, their simple act of courage transitioning from a rescue to a fight for their own survival. The simple act of flickering a lantern had saved 30 lives, but now threatened to cost 2. The hunt for the source of the unauthorized signal began in earnest. Lieutenant Kato's men, enraged by the failure of their perfectly laid trap, swept through the destroyed village with brutal efficiency. They were looking for the technological fingerprint of the enemy. A radio antenna, a battery pack, the telltale glint of Allied equipment. They interrogated the few remaining villagers, the old, the sick, those too frail to flee, with a terrifying, cold fury. The irony here is profound. The U.S. Army's intelligence gathering was a vast, bureaucratic, multi-million-dollar operation involving signal corps, aerial reconnaissance, and code-breaking, ultra, and magic. Yet, all this sophisticated apparatus had failed to predict the depth of Kato's ambush. The only successful piece of intelligence was delivered in a 2-minute window, transmitted by a children's code using a 50-cent piece of tin and kerosene. The Japanese, equally, were relying on the rigid, predictable patterns of American movement, their over-reliance on heavy armor, and their logistical demands. Their intelligence failure was in their inability to perceive a threat outside of a traditional military context. Marco and Clara, still hiding in the shadow of the church belfry, could hear the guttural shouts of the searching Japanese soldiers below. They held their breath, clutching the now extinguished lantern and a handful of moldy rice. The church had been their sanctuary, its crumbling walls their shield, but now it was a cage. Clara, her young mind calculating probabilities, whispered, "They are looking for a radio, Marco. They will not look for the light. They will look for anything that is not Japanese," Marco countered, his eyes fixed on the heavy wooden door below. "They will search everywhere. We must get away from the light." He carefully wrapped the lantern in a tattered sack, burying it beneath loose stones. The evidence of their heroism was now their greatest danger. The shift in the Americans' position had completely disrupted the Japanese timetable. Sergeant Moretti and his men, now positioned down by a brackish stream, were able to rest for the first time in days, the adrenaline slowly giving way to exhaustion. But the mystery gnawed at Moretti. He was a professional. He knew a stroke of luck wasn't enough. "We need to know the why," Moretti told Doc Miller. "If it was a radio signal, that means a deep cover agent. If it was a local, we owe them. And if it was a ghost, I need to see its face." His three-man scout team, Mac and two others, set out just before the first glimmer of false dawn, tasked with retrieving anything left in the abandoned foxholes and, critically, observing the hilltop. They moved like snakes, silent, slow, and low to the ground. When they reached the clearing, the evidence of the planned massacre was chillingly clear. The empty foxholes were visible, but scattered around them were dozens of spent cigarette butts, Japanese type. Shallow, meticulously concealed firing positions lined the jungle perimeter. The geometry of the crossfire was devastatingly obvious. 100 rounds delivered in the first 10 seconds would have wiped out the entire platoon. "Mother of God," Mac breathed, staring at the evidence. "They were waiting for us to put our heads down." One of the scouts pointed to a barely visible scrape in the earth. "Look, this is where a heavy machine gun would have been. And look over there, opposite side. Another one. Perfect crossfire." They confirmed Moretti's instinct. The platoon had been walking into a meticulously planned execution. Mac, the radio man, was the first to connect the two events. "Sarge ordered us back a minute after that flickering light. That light. It was the only warning. The only signal we got." They carefully took photographs and field notes of the ambush position, gathering spent Japanese casings and other debris for intelligence analysis. As the sun began to break over the Pacific, casting long, accusing shadows, they heard the sounds of the search party, Cato's men, now moving away from the hill and down towards the ruins of the village. The Japanese were closing in on the children. The scout team now faced a perilous choice: retreat and deliver the vital intelligence to Moretti, or follow the Japanese search party, knowing the immediate threat had shifted from the American soldiers to the unseen, unknown local who had saved them. The moral imperative, the debt of 30 lives, outweighed the tactical one. Mac made the call, lowering his rifle. "We're going to the village. We have to see who they're hunting. We're a rescue mission now." The irony of the military mission had flipped. The war of technology and strategy had been reduced to a simple human equation: gratitude and protection. The fate of the two children, who had risked everything on a code of light, now rested on the skill and courage of 3 tired soldiers who had barely understood the warning they received. The narrative of strategic war had temporarily become a simple, primal drama of chase and rescue, played out in the ruins of a colonial church. The morning sun, now high and brutal, beat down on the ravaged stone of the old church. Lieutenant Kato, his patience exhausted, oversaw the search. His rage was a cold, quiet thing, far more dangerous than any shout. The lack of any radio equipment, no wires, no antennae, no telltale American supplies, was turning his suspicion towards something far more local, far more personal. He cornered an old woman by the broken baptismal font, forcing her to look at him. "Who signals the Americans? Who gives the information? We know it was not a machine. We know it was a message. Tell me the children who run the streets." The old woman, bound by fear and the code of the local community, simply shook her head. "No children, only shadows. Kato's second-in-command, Sergeant Kijima, a grim, efficient man, found what Kato was truly looking for: a small, almost insignificant detail. High up in the crumbling belfry, on the stone ledge where Marco had rested the lantern, were faint, oily soot marks. They were smudges of kerosene and carbon, not caused by a fire, but by the focused, repeated placement of a lamp. Kijima pointed it out to Kato. "Lieutenant, look. Up high, they were not signaling on the ground. They were signaling high against the dark backdrop, and the soot, it's not from a cooking fire. It's concentrated, a controlled light." Kato's eyes widened with a sudden chilling understanding. It wasn't a sophisticated radio. It was something far simpler, something that mocked his reliance on technology. The vast complexity of the Imperial war effort was being undone by a handful of fuel. Marco and Clara, now hiding in the narrow space behind the altar, heard the whispers and the distinct sound of Japanese boots ascending the broken steps of the belfry. They were trapped. Marco tightened his grip on the small, rusty pocket knife that was their only defense. Just as the Japanese search team was closing in, a new element entered the fray: Mac's scout team. They had approached the village from the overgrown trail, moving silently through the dense foliage until they could see the church. They saw the Japanese patrol, their attention focused entirely on the ruins, and they knew the game was up. This was no longer a recon. It was a desperate close-quarters fight. "They're after the locals, not us," Mac whispered to his men. "They found the leak. We have to draw them off." Mac, using his training as a forward observer, took aim at a stack of ceramic tiles near the church entrance and fired a single, sharp burst from his M1 carbine. The noise was explosive in the stillness of the ruins. The tiles shattered, spraying dust and shrapnel. The effect was instantaneous, and exactly as Mac intended. The Japanese, conditioned to respond violently to any attack, immediately shifted their focus. The soldiers in the belfry froze. "Americans! They've returned!" Kato shouted, his face a mask of tactical fury, the humiliation of the previous night forgotten in the face of direct combat. He ordered his men to deploy and flank the entry points, assuming the main platoon was now attacking. The two men who were seconds away from finding Marco and Clara abandoned the search to grab their rifles and joined the firing line. This single, calculated move by Mac bought the children the critical seconds they needed. Marco pushed a loose stone in the wall behind the altar, revealing a narrow, ancient passage, a forgotten priest's escape route leading down to the village cemetery. "Go! Go!" Marco urged his sister, pushing her into the dark hole. He followed quickly, pulling the stone back into place just as Japanese boots pounded across the church floor. The sound of the firefight was deafening, a sudden explosion of noise that shattered the morning. Mac's three-man team was fighting a delaying action against a full Japanese company, relying on speed and the element of surprise. They fired and maneuvered, making sure every shot counted, giving the impression of a much larger force. The plan was to draw the Japanese away from the church long enough for the civilians, whoever they were, to escape, and then retreat quickly before the enemy realized the true size of the attacking force. The confrontation was swift, brutal, and asymmetrical. One of Mac's men took a bullet in the arm but kept fighting. Mac realized they couldn't hold. Their duty had been fulfilled, the Japanese were fully engaged, and the church was clear. "Fall back! Retreat to the river!" Mac yelled, laying down a final burst of covering fire. As they scrambled back into the jungle, fighting to hold off the advancing Japanese, the true scope of the debt was clear. 30 men saved by a flicker of light, 3 men now risking their lives to save the unknown messenger. The moral economy of the war had reached its climax, a debt of gratitude being paid in hot lead and raw courage. The confrontation in the ruins served not only to save the children, but to confirm beyond any doubt the existence of the heroic, silent warning. The 3 scouts were running, but they carried with them the certain knowledge that the flicker of the lantern was real, and the source was now in grave danger. Mac's scout team, bleeding and exhausted but alive, linked up with Sergeant Moretti's platoon at the river position. The intelligence they brought back was devastating and transformative. "Sarge," Mac reported, his uniform torn and bloodied. "The ambush was real, textbook crossfire. They were waiting on the hilltop for us to dig in. But here's the kicker. They were hunting the source of the warning in the village. It wasn't a radio. We found soot marks in the church belfry. It was a light, Sarge, a signal, a code." Moretti stared into the jungle, the chilling implication of the report washing over him. A few drops of kerosene had saved his entire platoon. The industrial might of the U.S. Army had been protected by the ingenuity of unseen locals. The debt was now more than moral, it was strategic. The villagers were not just victims of the war, they were active, courageous intelligence assets. They saved our lives. We just drew fire to help them escape, but we didn't confirm they got out, Moretti stated, his voice quiet but firm. We are going back. We can't leave them to be hunted down for saving us. This decision marked the true strategic shift for the platoon, and symbolically for the campaign itself. They were no longer simply fighting an enemy. They were fighting to protect an ally, the local population. Their mission was no longer purely about securing a hilltop, but about securing trust. The precision of the 2-minute warning became the centerpiece of Moretti's new plan. He realized that the person who sent the signal knew the Japanese tactical deployment as intimately as the IJA itself. They were a key asset. Moretti ordered a full-scale, aggressive movement back towards the village, but with a new objective, not to hold ground, but to crush Lieutenant Kato's command and signal to the local population that the Americans would fight for them. Meanwhile, Marco and Clara, having escaped the church, were crawling through the overgrown cemetery, an eerie landscape of broken Spanish tombs and tangled vines. They were exhausted and dehydrated. The sheer terror of the close call in the church was now settling into a numbing fatigue. They were running not from an attack, but from vengeance. As they emerged near a ruined well, they saw the main American column, Moretti's entire platoon, advancing cautiously but rapidly toward the village. The sight of the soldiers, now moving with a determined purpose, was both a terror and a hope. They were still foreign soldiers, but they were their soldiers. It was Clara who saw the glint first, a rifle barrel concealed in the dense bushes overlooking the well. Lieutenant Kato had left a small disciplined kill team behind, anticipating that the fleeing locals would use the well for water and rest. The vengeful Japanese commander was not going to let his prey escape so easily. Clara grabbed Marco's arm, her eyes wide with terror, pointing silently. Marco, his mind operating on instinct, knew he had no time for his old code. He did the only thing he could think of to warn the Americans who were now closing in. He grabbed a shattered piece of mirror from the well's edge and, using the afternoon sun, flashed a rapid, erratic beam of light directly into the path of the advancing U.S. column. No code, just raw, blinding panic. Sergeant Moretti, scanning the terrain, saw the sudden, frantic flash. It was too fast, too disorganized to be a tactical signal, but its origin, near the well, just ahead of the column, was unmistakable. It was the same light, the same urgency. "Ambush!" Moretti roared, hitting the dirt. "Take cover! Flank right! Fire at the bushes near the well!" The sudden shift in the American attack, from a cautious advance to a blistering, focused attack on the well, caught Kato's remaining kill team completely off guard. They were wiped out in a devastating hail of machine gun fire and rifle rounds. When the shooting stopped, Moretti cautiously approached the well. He found two small figures huddled behind the stone lip, trembling. Marco, holding the shard of mirror. Clara, holding him. "You," Moretti whispered, the relief washing over him. "It was you. The light." Marco, unable to speak English, simply nodded, his eyes wide, pointing at the bushes where the Japanese had been concealed, then making the rapid, rhythmic, flash-flash, pause-flash motion with his hand. The silence was broken by the recognition. The American commander finally understood the full gravity of the 2-minute warning and the courage of the two children. The debt was repaid, not just with rescue, but with a new, stronger alliance built on shared danger and respect. The human element had triumphed over the technological. The immediate aftermath was one of quiet, profound respect. Marco and Clara, given water and food, were questioned through a local interpreter. Their story, the fisherman's code, the danger of the hilltop, the 2-minute window, was corroborated by Mac's notes on the Japanese ambush geometry. The information they possessed was strategic gold. The ability to predict the IJA's movements based on their silent preparations was an invaluable asset that saved not only Moretti's platoon, but led to the successful clearance of the Leyte coastline in the following days. Lieutenant Kato's humiliation was complete. His failure to adapt, his inability to see the local population as anything other than an obstacle, led to his ultimate downfall. Driven by vengeance and a shattered sense of honor, his remaining company was scattered, hunted down not by superior technology, but by the relentless, coordinated actions of Moretti's platoon and local resistance groups, guided by the very intelligence network Kato had dismissed. The legacy of the Lantern's Whisper is not a story of a great military victory, but of the fundamental, often forgotten truth of warfare. The human factor always overrides the machine. The 2 minutes of flickering light were more effective than days of aerial surveillance. The two children, Marco and Clara, survived the war. They became symbols of the Filipino resistance, their story becoming a hushed legend among the GIs who served in the Pacific, a reminder that courage comes in all sizes and intelligence in the simplest of forms. The P-47 Thunderbolt might have ruled the sky and the M4 Sherman the battlefield, but on that single night in Leyte, the battle for survival was won by a rusty kerosene lantern. It was a victory of human ingenuity over rigid military doctrine, of local knowledge over industrial might. It was a testament to the thousands of unsung civilian heroes who chose a side and risked everything, armed with nothing more than cunning and a desperate need for freedom. The cost of war is always measured in lives, but the measure of human spirit is in the risks taken for strangers. Sergeant Moretti's platoon never forgot their debt. They were the men who lived because two children dared to break the silence of the night, proving that even in the darkest hours of the Second World War, the smallest light could cast the longest shadow. Their 2-minute warning became a permanent fixture in the oral history of Charlie Company, a reminder that sometimes the most sophisticated warning system is simply the human heart, beating out a message of danger into the darkness. The story of the vast, devastating Pacific campaign is often told through the lens of aircraft carriers and amphibious landings. But on a small, nameless island, two children proved that the greatest strategic asset in any war is not the size of the bomb, but the simplicity of the warning. The flicker of that lantern remains, even today, a silent monument to courage. If you found yourself captivated by the suspense and the historical detail of this untold story, please remember to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Your engagement allows us to continue bringing these meticulously researched and dramatically narrated chronicles of the Second World War to light.